So we're beginning a series that's going to take us through the next 4 weeks in this book of Ruth. It's a little book, but it is jam-packed full. It's been really carefully crafted as a piece of writing. It's beautifully written. And in this little book, the writer gives us, in just 4 chapters, a glimpse into what God has been doing over the whole of human history. The book focuses, though, on one little family. And so we're going to read through it together this morning. We're going to pause at different places to feel what's going on in the story. We're going to take a wee step back and try and unpack some of what we're seeing as we watch the lives of these people unfold. And then we're going to try to see how this story that happened so long ago about this little family so far away might just have a really big message for you and me today. Okay? This is a true story, and this is what God wants us to hear today. So, if you've got it open in front of you, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Now, stop there. Like all good stories, Ruth opens with a kind of long, long ago in a country far, far away. The place that our story is going to take place in is the promised land that God gave to his people Israel in the Old Testament. The time in which our story unfolds takes us back a page in our Bibles to the book of Judges, the days when the judges ruled. And what a time to be alive it was. The days of the judges were dark days. Look, if you've got your Bible there, look back a page, look at the last verse of the book of Judges. Just before we get to Ruth, it says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. What we see in Judges is that God's people again and again stray and sin against God, which brings judgment from the Almighty in order to turn them back to himself. Before they cry out to him for mercy, he delivers them. But again and again, they stray again and they sin again. It's like a cycle. But instead of getting better and better through the book of Judges, it's like a vortex as this cycle whips round and round and down and gets darker and deeper. Terrible things were happening amongst the people of God. It makes for really horrible reading. When I was a kid, I thought it made for amazing reading. Because some of this stuff you can hardly believe is in the Bible. But actually, as you get older, you realise it's horrific. It's horrible reading. It's hard to believe it's in the Bible. It's hard to believe that this stuff was happening amongst God's people. They were meant to be a distinctly holy people, just like their God was holy. But instead, we find in the book of Judges that God's people had embraced all the wickedness of all the nations around them. They raped and they murdered. They followed after false gods and idols, even to the point of sacrificing their own children to them. In the days when the judges ruled, God's people descended deeper and deeper into pride and lust and violence and vengeance and idolatry. This was a dark time to live. Note that. In many ways, it's not altogether different from our own time. Could we not say today that God's ways have been abandoned and that everybody does what is right in their own eyes? Everybody does what they please. As Judges ends and Ruth begins, we find ourselves looking at this scene and looking around and saying, God, what's happening? What are you up to here? And so as God's people, we need to be reassured that even when darkness seems dominant and when we feel helpless and we feel hopeless, God remains in control and lovingly at work for his people. The first chapter of the book of Ruth is going to show us God's loving kindness in the bitterness of life. Okay? Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 to 5 sets the scene. And as we read this, I want you to feel the darkness getting darker. In the days when the judges ruled, There was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. This first wee section, as we open the book of Ruth, displays to us God's loving warning in the bitterness of life, as we watch God's people following the deadly path of doing as they please. These must be some of the most tragic and sad verses in the whole of the Bible, verses 1 to 5. Goes from bad to worse, from dark to darker. A famine in the land is how it starts out. Now imagine hunger, and I'm not talking like a little bit hungry. Not like you've missed your morning roll at the new wee cafe. Not that kind of hunger. This is a hunger like you don't know where your next bite of food's going to come from. Imagine it. This was the kind of hungry where you don't know how you're going to feed your family. You're watching them wasting away before your eyes. You're watching their empty bellies swell with hunger. Put yourself in their shoes. This is desperate. We're going to see in the book of Ruth that places and names are really important. There's almost a cruel irony here as Bethlehem, which means house of bread, finds that its cupboards are empty and its harvest is decimated. There is no bread in the house of bread. Now, we'd be forgiven as people in the 21st century for looking at this really sad story and thinking what we're seeing here is a series of unfortunate events. It is really bad luck. It is freak circumstances that have come upon this family. We sometimes think about life like that, don't we? Sometimes fate smiles at us, and sometimes not so much. To quote Forrest Gump, if you'll forgive me, life is like a box of chocolates. Maybe even like a bag of chocolates, if you'll let me stretch his wee analogy, like a bag of Revels. Sometimes you pull one out, you put it in your mouth, it's a nice one, it's a chocolate, it's a caramel. Sometimes, though, you bite into it and it's coffee. It's bitter. You never know what you're going to get. Random chance. But when the judges ruled, the situation is different. God had made really clear that famine didn't happen by chance. Famine was one of the judgments that God had warned his people would come as a result of their sin and unfaithfulness to him. Here we are in the days of the judges, witnessing judgment from God on his people for their idolatry and evil. Not by chance. This is God acting drastically to turn his people back to himself. He'd warned them. He'd lovingly warned them. This will be the case for your sin. He'd made it clear. But the people had sinned anyway. And as God promised, here comes famine. Now, Elimelech is a man like many of us. He's practically minded. And so he sees famine as a problem to be solved. And so he takes his wife and his sons and he heads off to Moab for a while. Now, before we start to consider why this is such a stupid thing to do, I want you to think about what you would have done as you saw your wife and child wasting away before you. The end of Judges told us that there was no king in Israel to turn to for help. But that was because God was supposed to be their king. God was supposed to be the king of the people of Israel. Ironically, again, the name Elimelech means, my God is king. But here we find him deserting the land his God had given him and running off to somewhere else, the greener grass of Moab. The promised land was where God lived with his people. So to walk away from the promised land was to walk away from the presence of God. And Moab is where they go. Now, Moab doesn't hit us as it should. Moab is the place they go. Moab historically was hostile territory. This wasn't just desertion from their God and their king. This was defection to the enemy. Moab was a shameful place full of shameful people. This is worse than a Scot going off to live in England. And I can say that because I'm English. Much worse. These were people who had always been hostile to the people of Israel. These were people who were known across the Eastern world for their sexual immorality in all its many forms. These were people who worshipped a god called Chemosh, better thought of as a demon than a god. This is a god who delighted in human sacrifice, who loved to even receive the sacrificed children of his people. These were people who butchered their own children to sacrifice to an idol. Moabite women were known as being seductresses who would lead away Israelite men into worshipping this god, who the Bible elsewhere says is the abomination of Moab. This is where they go. This is where they go. The famine should have made them cry out to God and say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. But instead, off they go to Moab. God had delivered his people before. For 40 years he fed them every day after day, with bread that he provided. But instead Elimelech takes his family from the land of promise to a land of compromise. This family are unfaithful to their God. And Elimelech takes his family to a place where the people are practicing all of the evil things for which this famine has come about in the first place. He thought Moab was the place to find food. He figured away from God was the place to find life. And can we not see so much of that in ourselves as we sit here looking at the actions of Elimelech so long ago? Particularly when life is hard, don't we look for help and hope so often in those places that God has said, do not go? I know how to please myself, we think. So when I feel stressed and overwhelmed, a couple of pills or a couple of bottles, I know that's going to make me relax a little bit and feel better. When we're feeling lonely or lustful, we think, I could jump on Tinder or call that number or visit that website, and there I'm going to find the solution to my needs. There I'll feel better. I know they're not a Christian. I know that sex is just for marriage, but I need this. When we're feeling discontented and insecure, we tell ourselves, well, if I had a little bit more, if I had a bit more money, if I just hold off on this generosity stuff we've been talking about for a month, for a little while till I have a little bit more, if I just go to Moab for a little while, then, once I've got enough, then I'll do this generosity thing. Or when we're young and bored, we tell ourselves, there's just so much out there I want to experience. There are so many clubs I want to hit. There are so many people that I want to pull. There is just so much I want to try. I want to have fun. I want to live. When I get older, then maybe I'll think about this God thing. When we read Moab in Ruth chapter 1, I want you to hear this. Anything that promises life that isn't God. Because so often we think that God doesn't love us and doesn't care for us when we find ourselves facing times of famine, darkness, and need. There's food in Moab, we think. What a sensible decision to go there. The grass looked greener in Moab because it was greener. Stuff was growing. Elimelech does just exactly what was right in his own eyes. But he doesn't recognize that the famine itself is God shouting in loving warning to his people, turn to me and live. Because have a look with me at where Moab leads, verse 3. tragedy. Elimelech dies. We don't know why he dies, just that he does die. And Naomi is left alone with her 2 sons. Heartbreak, grief, bitter loss. Now, for a woman in these days, being left a widow meant vulnerability. It meant no one to provide. It meant poverty. But at least she had 2 sons, right? Surely now her 2 sons will take mum back to their land, back to their people, back to their gods. But no. Instead, tragedy seems to push this family further from God. Despite the loss of their father, these boys think Moab is a pretty cushy deal. Moabite women kind of take their fancy, and so 2 Moabitesses are taken as brides. The years tick by. What started out as relocation for a while turns into 10 years. No grandchildren arrive in this time, which is another sign that God is displeased with what's happening here. God had warned, unfaithfulness to me means barrenness in the land and barrenness in the womb. Take the warning. And after 10 years, verse 5, both of Naomi's sons also die. And Naomi is left without her 2 sons and without her husband. It is tragic. It is barrenness, followed by death, followed by more barrenness, followed by more death. Just like that, left alone. No family, no provider, no security. No more children, no one to carry on the family name, an aging widow in a foreign land, grieving and lonely and hopeless. Naomi's life is bitterly sad. They thought Moab meant life, but it only led to death. And if you're here this morning and you know that you are far from God, then you also need to know that you are also far from life. Please do not believe the lie that life can be found away from Jesus. Do not believe the lie that life can be found in living as you please. That's a false hope that's offered. It is an illusion of life. When judgment rightly comes because of your sin and my sin, we will find that there is only one safe place to be. We will find that there is only one place that life can be found. It is in Christ Jesus. To hope in anything else leads only to death. And God lovingly warns you this morning that this is the case. With Naomi in this situation of hopeless desperation, the story continues. And we find God issuing her now with a loving call, offering her a place to turn at this place of rock bottom. Verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. At rock bottom here, God issues a loving call, saying, here is a place to turn. In her lonely bitterness, Naomi gets good news from home. The Lord has come to the aid of his people. He has provided food. And it seems here that her response is pretty immediate, actually. Her and her 2 daughters-in-law, they make preparations to head back to the promised land. At her lowest point, God offers the gentle, loving call of good news. She gets a reminder that, like so many times before, God has come to the aid of his people and he has provided. He doesn't leave her far away in Moab in the despair and darkness that sin has caused. The ties that bound her to that place have been cut for her. There's nothing left there for her. No joy in the present in Moab. No hope for the future in Moab. The choice for Naomi in some ways is really straightforward. Moab has clearly not been a place of blessing for Naomi. The decision to go back to Bethlehem, however, is a really, really difficult one for her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. In Moab, Naomi is a widow, a foreign widow, far from her people and far from her God. In Bethlehem, Ruth and Orpah are going to be foreign widows, far from their people and far from their God. There's a cost to this journey to Bethlehem that's beginning. And Naomi seems to know this. Verse 8, then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye. They wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. Now I want you to think at this point about your relationship with your in-laws if you've got them. Not all in-law dynamics are like this. This is a beautiful thing. A beautiful thing. Naomi blesses her daughters-in-law here and seeks to release them from any sense of obligation they might feel towards her to join her on the journey. Go back to your mother's home, back to your people, back to hopefully the home of a new husband who will provide for you. Just like Elimelech saw hope for his family in Moab, Naomi seems to see some hope for her daughters-in-law there. May the Lord show you kindness, she says, just like you've shown kindness to me. She kisses them. Now we need to pause here. This word kindness is going to be really important in the book of Ruth. This word kindness is the word used to describe the loving kindness of God. This is the generous, faithful love of God to his people, even when they've strayed to Moab. Even when they've stayed in Moab, even when they've gone down and down, darker and darker, finding themselves at that place of rock bottom, this is God's kindness that in that moment of bitter pain comes and offers good news. The Lord has come to the aid of his people. The loving kindness of God to remove every obstacle, to cut every tie that keeps us far from him, so that we would turn to him, head back to him, and live. Naomi doesn't yet see that the loving kindness of God is on display in what's happened to her so far. Her suffering distorts her vision like it so often does for us, so that she still sees Moab as a place of potential hope and life for her daughters-in-law. She really does love them. She's not trying to get rid of them. She really wants them to know God's loving kindness. You don't all weep aloud at the prospect of goodbye if there isn't a real, genuine, mutual affection. And Ruth and Orpah continue to say, no, we're going back with you. Verse 11, but Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait till they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. Naomi is persistent. She's persistent. Seriously, daughters, consider the cost in following me. A widow's life is a life of hardship. I'm too old. It would take too long to provide you more sons to marry. Who in Israel is going to marry you? Moabite widows. Bethlehem holds hardship for you. Moab might mean a new husband. Moab might mean more comfort. Moab might mean less suffering. It might mean an easier life. They weep again. And then Orpah weighs up Moab and Bethlehem. She puts them in the scales. She counts the cost. And she heads back to Moab. Going back to Bethlehem, turning to God, becoming a Christian, is costly. Jesus says, whoever does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Jesus says, whoever does not give up everything in order to follow me cannot be my disciple. And Jesus also says, before you begin, make sure you count the cost. There is good news calling you to turn to God and be saved, for he is God and there is no other, just like we read at the start. In turning to Jesus, there is life on offer, and it is even life to the full, but it is not the easier road. It is a narrow road that isn't wide enough for you to bring all the sin that you love. It is a narrow road that isn't wide enough to bring those things that would hold and have our hearts more than Jesus would. It's a path that is paved with suffering as we follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Life far from God may seem easier. It may seem more prosperous. It may look more straightforward. Moab still looks in many ways like life. The road there is wider. The road there is smoother. But the road there leads to death. And it leads to the destruction of hell. And so as you're sat here this morning, the challenge to you is to put into those scales what it will cost you to turn and follow Jesus, and what it will cost you to turn away from him. Today, God issues a loving warning, decide. He issues a loving call, choose. Which way will it be? Will it be like Orpah, like Elimelech, who make what looks like the smart choice, but it becomes apparent they counted up wrong? And this is the last time that we will hear of Orpah. But Ruth clings to Naomi. Verse 15. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. And then in the next few verses we have what must be some of the most emotional, most beautiful, loving words ever spoken by a daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. Verse 16. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I'll die. And there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Ruth's name means friend. And here we find her more than living up to her name. She's having none of this encouragement to go back to Moab. Don't ask me to leave. I've made up my mind. I've counted the cost. I'm determined to go. Realistically for Ruth, Bethlehem held hardship for her. No hope of any new husband. No hope of acceptance from people who will always see her as an outsider, who will always see her as an enemy, a product of sin. Bethlehem holds poverty for Ruth, discomfort, hunger. There might now be food in Bethlehem, but for Ruth, Bethlehem's going to still feel like famine. She throws off all of the things that used to define her. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I'm coming. This is Ruth's loving commitment to Naomi. Ruth is unswervingly declaring her determination to cling to Naomi, to turn toward Bethlehem, to trust in God who has called even her, though she was far from him, in her own grief, in her own sad situation, to call her by a demonstration of his loving kindness to his people in Bethlehem to turn. And when Naomi sees this, she says no more. It seems a bit harsh. Just stop speaking. Ruth has made her choice. And the question for us all sitting here this morning is, what will our choice be? As we think about Ruth's choice between Moab and Bethlehem, which way will we go? Will we head towards the relationships and the drugs and the money and the booze and the careers and the comfort that promise to us life and answers to our problems? Or will we turn to Jesus Christ? Because Jesus set out on a journey of his own. He journeyed from heaven to earth. And just like Ruth, he resolutely set his face towards the cross. He considered that the agonies he went through as he died on the cross in your place were worth the cost, so that you might be one of his people and he might be your God. He determined the path of suffering to be worth treading, so that in your hopelessness and in your helpless darkness, living far from him, he might issue you with this loving call: turn to me and live. Have you done that? Have you turned from all of your sin and the empty promises of life that the world have to offer? Have you turned to Jesus in full, wholehearted commitment? Maybe you need to return to that. Ruth set out on that path. Verse 19. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi? It's been a while." "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. Her name means pleasant. "Call me Mara," which means bitter. "Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." This has been a sad and a dark chapter in Naomi's life. And maybe you're here this morning and you feel something of the bitterness that Naomi has expressed in these verses. Her arrival back in Bethlehem didn't just all of a sudden mean that her life was all rosy. She's battered and she's bruised and she is broken by life. Imagine suffering like Naomi has suffered. And then every time someone calls your name, all you hear is pleasant, pleasant, pleasant. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. You might be able to say amen to that. Well, in the last scene in this chapter 1, we need to see God's loving promise that comes to us in the bitterness of life. Naomi is back, bitterly empty, but she is now in the place where blessing begins. Naomi's understanding of God is exposed and expressed to us by what she calls him. Did you notice that? Two things: the Almighty and Lord. She recognizes, God, you are Almighty. You have been in control over even my suffering that I have gone through. But she also knows that God is Lord, capital Lord. Yahweh is what that means. The covenant name of the covenant God of his people Israel, the one who has made promises of blessing to his people. She knows that is who he is. But she just struggles to see past her suffering. She feels empty. She's needy. Her immediate needs just the same as it was at the start. Food. Where's it going to come from? Who's going to provide? Not just for herself, but because Ruth's refused to go back to Moab, now she's got an extra mouth to feed. This is going to be a drain on her little resources. And her only real hope of this need being met is the prospect of new family. But she is old. These things seem so impossible. No way forward for Naomi. Verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Compare this last verse in chapter 1 with the first verse. The God who has been almighty over her own life in all that she has suffered has already acted on behalf of his people in taking them from famine to harvest. Judgment has already been turned for God's people into blessing. They've arrived at the beginning of barley harvest. God has provided, is what this tells us. And empty though Naomi feels, at her side is Ruth the Moabite, who God is going to unexpectedly use to bless Naomi with all of her needs: food, family. Very often, the things that make life hard are the very things that God uses to bless us. So let me encourage you this morning, if you're one of his people, wait on him. There are still some chapters to go in this story. Wait and see what God is going to do. If you're here this morning feeling empty because the world's promises of life have proved themselves to be hollow, remember that this is where blessing begins. Empty-handed, coming to Jesus, God the Son, who emptied himself, who came to earth, taking on the form of a servant, being obedient to death, even the death of a cross. Jesus, who understands every tear of loss and pain that we shed. Even battered and bitter, there is hope for you in him. The tragedy of Naomi's life has teed up blessing that God's about to drive right into her story. Not just in spite of her suffering, but in fact, through her suffering. Isn't it amazing that even the past stupidity of our lives and the past sin of our lives doesn't spell the end of the road? Today, God calls us to turn to him, and he even uses the pain of the sin that we have committed to bring us blessing. Naomi should never have met Ruth. Her son should never have married her. She is a drain on her resources, having returned. But Ruth is going to be the key to God bringing blessing to Naomi. The worst thing, think of it, the worst thing ever done by human hands, the worst crime ever committed, the worst sin ever done was when we crucified Jesus, the Lord of glory. And as he hung on the cross in our place for our sins, his executioners lifted up to him a sponge filled with sour wine. Jesus tasted the deep bitterness of sin and death. Why? Because in that very act, he was bringing blessing and life to his people. What tastes bitter might just be what's best. And so even when hope appears hidden, God's promise stands. Famine to harvest, judgment to blessing, death to life. He is a God who fills the empty with good things. And in the dark bitterness of life, we can trust that the Lord's loving promise to you will not fail. And as long as it's been, this is God's word to us in Ruth chapter 1.